Good morning, Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1260. Aleph Reish Samach. So we've learned about the difference between Gan Eden on its own, which is Atzei Havaya, the trees of Havaya and Gan Eden, Havaya. So it's a higher revelation than the regular revelation in the worlds, which comes through the Tzimtzum of Elokim. And it refers to, like he said, the last thing we learned, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. Both are connected to Birurim. They're connected, in other words, to existence. Even the tree of life, it's just on a higher level, like he says, Teresh B'Ksav. It's L'mayla Me'Birus Teresh. I'm sorry. Chochma berura be'etzem kol mokim harihu lahavdil ben atomim v'atoy. So even though it's Teresh B'Ksav and it's a higher, clear level of divine intelligence, but it's still involved and engaged with separating between the pure and the impure, as the Torah describes. Then there's a deeper level in Torah, the true taimei Torah, the reasons, and the pnimius, the taimei, the real tam, the deeper taste or the inner taste that's higher than berurim, like higher than food and higher than hunger. And that is the taste for say that comes through Avodah, and especially through the Torah mitzvahs that comes after tshuva, where the soul goes all the way back to the tainug atzmi bilti murgish, that's not tangible and not sensed, that's higher than Torah. And that's what also on the future, Biy'a Mashlishi, which refers to this highest level. Like he said in the Osalavi, there are two levels, two stages. The Suda of Levyasin Asher Habar, the meal, so it's connected to a meal. And Asher Habar is Birurim, as he explained at the bottom of page 1259. And then that's like the end of the Birurim, of the work of the Birurim in our time. And then a higher level, and that's Einig Atzmi Murgish, that's felt. Then there's a higher level of Eim Ayil Mahaba, Eim Bayachil V'Shtia, the level of Atreseim, Bereisheim, Keser, the Imi, which is the Einig Atzmi built in Murgish Klal. The deeper secrets that are fundamentally concealed, and Ashbi was not allowed to reveal them, as I explained yesterday, and only to himself, because it's Sasum Be'etzem. And that's Mesukim Midvash. That means sweeter than honey and honeycomb, Dvash v'nefes seifim. It's sweeter. Why is it sweeter? Because Dvash refers to Einig Murgish, a core, Atzmizdika pleasure, but it's sensed. And now we're talking about Atzmizdika pleasure where you're completely one with the entity itself. That's higher. That's Yizbu Atzei Havaya. That's the Yizbu. So Seided means, in other words, not just you filled, not just the absence of hunger, and not just filled to the brim, but going beyond, like Ashirus, a wealth of a qualitative different shift that's beyond the level of altogether of hunger. And the hunger, you could say you're hungry, then you fill the hunger. That too, we saw two levels. That the hunger comes from lack of eating, or the hunger comes from eating and you want more. Then there's a level that's beyond the hunger altogether, and that's Yizbu. So all this goes back to the point that we're talking earlier, the highest level of Mutva Murgish Muskel, where the moichin, the mind, and the emotions have all elevated now, gazing at Atik, at Arich and Atik, the Ayin, Hayesh Ba'etz im Ayin, the level of Ayin Keser, all being absorbed in all-consuming love, that's Negei Benefesh. That was the Avodah of this. In Gan Eden language, it's Yizbu Atzei Havaya, higher than Gan Eden on its own. Now we still need to understand what is the Avodah that leads to that, but we know before, the Avodah is Ava B'chol Meidecha. Birurim, like B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, reaches levels of the divine as it relates to existence. So therefore, Gan Eden, it's like Moichin, like Zah, that the Moichin that are Moichin of Zah, not Moichin Be'etzem, not Bina, Atzmiz Bina, and Atzmiz Chochma, not that higher level that is connected to the Einig Bilti Murgish. And the Avodah B'chol Meidecha, where B'siras Nefesh, that leads us to the level of Gan Eden that's beyond the natural Gan Eden of its own, on its own. But we still need to understand, because even on its own is also there's Birurim involved. So he hasn't explained that yet, but it's understood because it's still relative to existence as opposed to something chodosh that comes from the yichud pnimi of Chochma and Bina. Yichud pnimi, yeah. Okay. So now he's going to continue Yizbu by saying the following. The new paragraph on page 1260 starts with Medrash Rabbah. In Medrash Rabbah on the pasuk on Yizbu Atse Havaya, the Medrash Rabbah says like this. Medrash Rabbah Breishis Reish Parsha Tezvav. This is Breishis Rabbah. This is Medrash Rabbah on the Breishis, the beginning of section 15. Isa, this is what it says. Yizbu, on the word Yizbu, Atse Havaya says Yizbu Chayeyim. Their lives were sated. It says three different expressions. Yizbu Meimeyim. Their waters were sated in abundance. Yizbu Matosam. Their plantings. Matosam comes from the word Vayita. Their plantings, in other words, what they planted in the fields. So their lives, their waters, and their plantings and sowings, in other words, the agricultural department, so to speak, all of them experiencing Yizbu means abundance, sated beyond the regular. Because again, to eat, vachalta means you eat, v'savata means you filled yourself to the brim or even beyond, as we discussed what svia is. So now the Rebbe Rashab is going to bring this medrash into the discussion. Upirish, what is the meaning? Upirish yizbu chayeyim. What is the meaning that their lives were sated? Ukameshakosa b'zayar achrei dafnun chesam alf. So the first step, what it means the lives are saved, what does that mean? A person's alive, they're not alive. So he says in Zohar Achrei, it's volume 3, 58a, that's the page, Mashmei Tahunar Yubal Shmei. What is the name of that river? So he says it's Yuval. That's the name of the river that we find in Bereshis. Shenemer Val Yuval Yishlach Shiroshav. On Yuval, on the river Yuval, which is the name of a river, Yishlach Shoshav, he extended his roots. He planted his roots. Ubisifrod Rabbi Hamamnuna Saba. This is a medrash of Rabbi Hamnuna Saba, one of the Tanoim, one of the sages. So he says, Chaim Shmei. Okay, so the Zohar asks, what's Mashmei Dahuna? What's the name of the river? So one opinion is Yuval Shmei. In the Sifra, the Rabbi Nusasi says Chaim Shmei. Its name is Chaim, life, Chaim. And what is that referring to? Ilona, and the Rebbe Rashab adds, Bechina Zah, the tree, the level of Zah. We said earlier the tree is the level of Zah, that's where things, as it grows, level of Zah. The Nota Sharshe Be'inun Chaim, he planted his roots in Be'inun Chaim, in that level called Chaim, in that river called Chaim. B'chinas Bina Shu Mokra Chaim de Zah. So the tree is the level of Zah, its roots is the level of Bina, which is the source of the life of the Chaim, of the energy of Zah. That's what he's saying. Now all this is cryptic Kabbalistic terms, which of course is going to be relevant to our whole discussion. And this last paragraph is actually really tying up all the knots, this whole topic of Yizbu. And next page will begin, like, so to speak, another chapter in Ayin Beis. So this is the last wrap up of this idea. So he says, okay, so what do we establish? That in Zohar there are two opinions. The name of the river is either Yuval or Chaim. And according to Chaim, Chaim is Zah. And the roots of it is Bina, the source of the Chaim, the life of Zah. Shalzeh Nemar, Ki'imcha Mokar Chaim. Mokar Chaim. Ki'imcha, with you, is the source of life. What's Mokar Chaim? Bina is the Mokar of Chaim. So life is an energy flow, Zah, the Midas, and Bina is the Mokar of that, according to the Sifra de Rabbi Hamnuna Saba. Kameshir Kosa B'Zoyar, Daf Kuf Aleph, Emir, Daf Kuf Aleph Amar Aleph, Ub'migdash Melech Sham. Like it says in Zohar Emir 101a, and in the commentary called Migdash Melech. Okay, so the Rebbe Rashab is grounding this. He's ready to bring two zayas here. And one of the points of what he's doing is the Rebbe Rashab, as we see from time to time in Ayin Beis, there's the explanation of the ideas, and then there's where he grounds it in the sources to really fully round out and show and demonstrate its, first of all, its comprehensive nature, but also the grounding and that this is very consistent with the original sources of these ideas. So they're not just concepts, they're actually grounded in psukim, in verses, in medrashim, in zayas, and so on. So that's what he says. However, this, as we're going to remember this language. We've learned about Zah and Bina a number of times. Zah is emotions, Bina is intelligence. But the emotion, the intellect, the cognitive of Bina can be one that's chitzenius Bina. Aim revetzes ala efrechim. The mother, as it hovers over and gives birth to and protects and guides and trains the emotions. That we learned was a lower level. That was mudva, murgish mitzad ha-seichel. The seichel guiding our natural emotions. Then there's going to be pnimius Bina, which is shalach to shalach ha'se'im, where the mother grows back to her stature together with Chochma. And so he's going to say, ach, zeh b'chinas chitzenius Bina, she mokar achayim dezah. This, where we say that Bina is the source of life of Zah, is like the mother that's giving life and sustaining the midas, the children. But that's chitzenius Bina. Yuval. The Yuval di Yuval. The Yuval, the Inyan Yovel, the Yuval di Yovel, the Melupan begins chitzenius Bina. The Yovel bechelam begins primius Bina. Okay. The word Yuval can be read Yuval, like I just did it. It could be Oisa Yovel. So in the Nekudis, in the punctuation in Hebrew, a chaylam makes it like a oi. Oi is chaylam, u is malupam. There are two different punctuation marks. So when you say Yuval, Yuval, that's, he says, is primius Bina. I'm sorry, that's chitzenius Bina, but malupam. And Yovel, Yoy, instead of you, Yovel, which was, of course, we refer to the Jubilee year. The 50th year is called Yovel, not Yuval. That, he says, b'chelim is the level of primius Bina. Now, the meaning of that needs a little more elaboration. That I need to look up. But basically, the same words what he said in the Zohar. What's the name of the Nar? I said Yuval because that's what it says in Chumash, but you can pronounce Yovel or Yuval. So Yuval is the outer dimension of Bina as it relates to Zah, and Yovel with a chaylam, Yoy, instead of you, is the inner Bina, inner dimension of Bina. And that is the meaning, because that you shall sanctify the 50th year. Yovel is Bina, the 50 gates of Bina, Chamishim Shari Bina, but it's the primius Bina. That's why you shall sanctify it. It's talking about Bina in its exalted higher state. So again, he's rounding out these ideas that we've learned and bringing sources. So a lot what we learn now, we have another connection to Yovel and Yuval. Now, I'm not sure how it's consistent with Chaim Shmoi or Yuval Shmoi. Is it two opinions? It seems to be that Yuval now and Chaim are the same level. It's Zah, and Bina, the mocker of that is Bina, but Chitzeni is Bina. Primius Bina is called Yovel, the Jubilee year, the Kiddashtim. Okay. So basically, he brought the Medrash to explain that means Yizbu Chayeyem, I assume. Well, I don't want to assume because he's probably going to spell it out. But Yizbu Chayeyem would mean Chayeyem on its own is Zah, and Chitzeni is Bina. Yizbu Chayeyem means their lives will be sated and filled. Yizbu is from Primius Bina, Yovel. That's what it looks like he's saying. Mokra Chaim. Okay. Higher than Mokra Chaim. I'm sorry. More higher than that. Finis boily ill, and it was explained earlier that Gili de Gan Eden is Bina. That the revelation of Gan Eden is the level of Bina. We learned that clearly. V'nahar yatsa me'Eden. A river extended from Eden. Eden is Chochma. The river is Bina that was in the Hashkes Sagan to irrigate the garden. So the Garden of Eden, we learned, is the level of Bina. And this is what the Medrash says, that their lives, their sustenance should be sated, filled up. Chayim of what? The life of Shel B'chinas Atzei Hashem. The trees in Gan Eden should the lives of these trees should be sated B'chinas Gili Er Chodosh Ma'atzmus Ein Sof. That they should receive Yizbu, not just their regular irrigation, not just their regular level of flow of energy, but in the form of being sated from Er Chodosh, the new energy that comes from the Atzmus Ein Sof, which is Pnimius Bina. That is Yizbu Chayeyim. What's the next level? Yizbu Meimeyim. So their lives, he's talking about the sustenance, the lives of the trees. What's next? Meimeyim is a higher level. That their waters, what water, what does that refer to? Yizbu Meimeyim hu amshacha b'b'chinas Chochma. Ukiyadua be'inyan mayim rakia, the mayim b'chinas Chochma. So mayim, Chayeyim refers to Bina. It could be Chitzenius Bina, that's giving chayes to the Zoh, or Yizbu Pnimius Bina, going all the way to Atzmus Ein Sof, gazing at Arich Hanatik and drawing down Er Chodosh. Meimeyim refers to Chochma. We say Oir Mayim Rakia, so Mayim is the level of Chochma. So here the waters are referring to Chochma, not Bina. So he says, yes. Hamshach b'chinas Chochma. Kuyidu b'iner Mayim Rakia b'chinas Chochma. Rak shezeu chitzenius ha-Chochma. So here too, Chochma has an outer dimension of Chochma. Who inyan kemaya the ashkeli lana b'chinas chsadim da Abba. So we say this also in Pasuk Eliyahu, like the water that irrigates the tree. So what water is irrigating the tree? So we talked before, Bina is the source of life. Bina is the source, the Chayim of Zoh. So that's the two levels, Chitzenius and Pnimius Bina. Water, we're talking about, it's like the level of Maya, the water that irrigates the tree, which is Chsadim da Abba. This is waters or Chesed. Chesed and water are equated with one another. The generosity or the kindness and the love and the waters of Abba, of Chochma. Ukiyadua, and he's going to explain what this means. Ukiyadua, as it's known, the Gili Hakav Ikre b'B'chinas Chochma Datzilis. So the Gili Hakav, which is like the main, you could say the main water line, the main line that brings the divine energy, where does it primarily radiate? Or where is it primarily prominent? In the level of Chochma Vatzilis. So the Kav is a general Kav that goes through all Ishtalshalos. But in Atzilus, but in the levels itself, Chochma is the first place. That's where the Kav is the level of Chochma. So it's like an irrigator. It brings the source of energy. And through Chochma, the Gili comes also in Zoh. So let me explain. We have a Garden of Eden. In the garden, there are trees. What irrigates these trees? A river that runs into the garden. But where does the river come from? The river is Bina. So Bina irrigates, or I would say Bina sustains Mokar HaChaim, the trees of Gan Eden. Yizbu Chayeya means that it should be Pnimius Bina. But where does Bina get its water from? A river gets water from Eden. Nor Yotzame Eden, the Chochma. It gets water from Chochma, which is the source. It's like the river gets water from the Mayon, from the spring, from a live spring. And so Chochma too now, he says that the waters of Chochma also have Chitzenius Chochma, which feeds the river, which in turn feeds Zoh. And Pnimius, we want Yizbu, Maimeya means that their waters should also be abundant and sated. And that's what it means when we say that this means, and it irrigates to the tree with that flow. And that flow is like its soul. We learned this earlier. The ikar ashras haneshama hu b'moyach u'mispashet b'chol ha'evarim. So he's saying, So the neshama, which is the source of life, where does it reside? It resides in the moichin, ubamoyach, in the mind, which begins with chochma. So even though chochma is not the soul, but that's where the soul resides, and from there it extends to all the limbs. So think exactly like irrigation. When you irrigate a field or a garden, the water comes from an original source. That source breaks into channels. That's how you irrigate a field. Those channels are already the channels of Bina, as it develops and becomes the river that breaks into parts that irrigates the different trees in Gan Eden. But those channels come from Chochma, and that in turn is drawing down the energy from the neshama, that flow. Yeah. So he's saying, so now we know Chochma is the level of Mayim, the root of the Mayim, and he's saying Yizbuch Me'Mayim. He'll say in a minute that's just Chetzenius Chochma, but Primius Chochma. In the parentheses he adds, Ule'el Dibra Maskel Vayikach Kerach. In volume 2, in the Mayim of Vayikach Kerach, he said, this boy, the Mashakosur, the Ashkelilon Yeshlem Shezel Primius Hakav. What it says that it irrigates the tree, you're talking about Primius Hakav. So you're just qualifying the levels. It could refer to Chetzenius Hakav, like Chetzenius Chochma, or it could refer to Primius Hakav, which is the higher level that we're referring to here. Yizbu. Just qualifying that. Va'oir. Now, we say Oir Mayim Rekiya, we know not just Mayim, but also Oir is the level of Chochma. Va'oiru Gamken Chochma, Avazel Primius HaChochma. But that is exclusively Primius HaChochma. Mayim, you have the level of Chetzenius HaChochma. But Ayin Mashin is Bar Le'il, and look earlier, it was discussed in the Mayim Dibra Maskel Ba'ata Tetzava Be'inyan Oir Mayim Rekiya. That's an acronym, Aleph Mem Reish. Oir Mayim Rekiya, 3 levels. Oir is the purest form, Primius Chochma. Mayim is Chetzenius Chochma. And Rekiya is usually Bina, actually. But he's not going into Rekiya right now. V'zeu Yizbu Me'Mayim. And this is the second phrase in the Medrash, that their waters shall be sated, shall be filled. B'mchinas Pnimius v'atzmus HaChochma. So Chochma itself is the outer dimension of Chochma. Me'Mayim, water is Chochma. Yizbu, just like we said, Yizbu Chayeyem, their source of life from Bina, should come from the sated level. Yizbu, a higher level, so too now Me'Mayim, that Chochma from Primius and Atzmus, he says, Primius v'atzmus HaChochma. V'hainu, of course, Mepchinas Yichud Pnimi, the Abba v'Ima. This means Yizbu is from the Yichud Pnimi, not Yichud Chetzeni, but the inner union, the internal union of Chochma and of father and mother, Chochma and Bina. And finally, the third statement in the Medrash, Matosan. Matosan is their plantings. What's Yizbu Matosan? So he says, Yizbu Matosan Yeshlemer Shehem Bechinas Zun. That's a lower Zah and Malchus. Shazel Bechinas Hanatias da Abba v'Ima. Abba me'Ima, what are their plantings? What does it give birth to? The plantings is Zah and Malchus. The tears of Abba v'Ima. And delve or look elsewhere. The Inyan Eser Netias Not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There are 10 plantings that God planted. Shehein Eser Spheres Datzilus. So the 10 spheres are referred to plantings, like saplings, plantings, and that would clearly indicate that Zah and Malchus are the 7 lower ones, and the 3 higher ones is Chochma. So he's saying that Netias here he's talking about is Zun, that is an outgrowth of Chochma and Bina, and the parentheses just as reference that the spheres are called plantings. Okay. Gam Yeshlemer. We can also explain, we can also say that Atzi Avayu B'chinas Gan Eden D'Atzilus, that the trees of Avaya is Gan Eden of Atzilus. And he's giving now another explanation. First he said it's Zun, so I guess Yizbu Matosam would be that Zun too should not just be the regular flow of Zohar Malchus, but they should be Yizbu elevated to the higher level, maybe the level of Bina. Like we said, Imi doesn't specifically spell it out, but he's giving now another way to explain this medrash. He says you can also say that the trees of Avaya is Gan Eden within Atzilus. Just for the record, there's Gan Eden usually is Biy'a and Yetzirah and Asiyah. Gan Eden Elyon, Gan Eden Atachten. But there is also a level of Gan Eden in Atzilus. The Alter Rebbe brings it in Tanya, in Hagah, I believe, in chapter 40, something like that, if I recall correctly. There is Atzilus, so in Gan Eden and Atzilus, so he's saying the trees of Avaya is not Gan Eden Atzilus. And there you're talking, so their life and their water should be sated. That's not Atzilus. And the plantings is referring to a lower level of Gan Eden. Hainu Gan Eden shebe Biy'a, the level of Gan Eden as it's in Biy'a Yetzirah Asiyah. As it's known, there are a number of levels of Gan Eden. Ad ein kates, without end. The abundance of all. It's referring to all the different levels of Gan Eden. I will explain this a bit. I just want to finish the paragraph and then I'll explain it. When the transmission comes from the inner dimension of Chochma and Bina, the revelation also is transmitted and drawn also into the higher level of Gan Eden, which is in the world of Biy'a. So that's what he's saying, that their plantings, even the lower level, is also receiving from the higher levels of the Yichud Pnimi that is drawing into the Gan Eden. Like he says in Eitz Chaim, which he already cited earlier, when there's a complete union, in contrast to a not complete union, when there's a complete union of Chochma and Bina, of the father and mother, the godless lezun, when Moichin Gemurim, the complete cognitive energy and intelligence, is being drawn into the maturity of Zohar and Malchus, like we learned, the highest levels of emotional maturity, then another thing happens. Additionally, that through this reflection, also adds the level of mature cognitive energy into Chochma of Biy'a, not just into the higher level, in Biy'a. Now you may remember, this is critical, if you remember he asked the question long ago, on the beginning of the subject, he asked the question, which is so relevant to the Ayin Beis theme of interface. He asked, if Gan Eden is Biy'a, I'm looking at the page, I'll tell you what page he asked this question. Here. I believe, 1 second. Yeah. On page 1219, it's a while ago, he said, Gan Eden is the level of Bina Sheba Malchus, and that's the difference between Gan Eden and the worlds. So he says like this. 1 second. Actually, the question is earlier. I'm sorry. No, the question was earlier here. Much earlier, actually. Yeah. On page 1213, he said Gan Eden is the level of Ir Havai Datzilis, but Gan Eden is Biy'a. So he asked, since Gan Eden is rooted in Atzilus, how could Atzilus go into Biy'a and for sure Atziyah when it's such lower level? And there's a parsa, a partition that separates. How could the souls receive the energy and not become annihilated? And that's where we began the whole subject matter. Now, the context of Ayin Beis is, if you remember back in volume 2, big question, how do we experience a pre-symptom consciousness in a post-symptom reality? How do we experience, in the words of the Magid, how do we experience the divine unity of Atzilus in Biy'a? So very much the conversation we're having here throughout all these pages is exactly to answer that question. That even though We begin as mutva, as natural creatures that are impulsive, reflexive, and behavioral. We grow, and as we grow, that's all the levels of the Atzei Havai, the trees that grow, that's the midas that grow. They slowly start receiving from the cognitive levels, all the way that they start receiving from Atzilus, all the way from Arich and Atik. So that's answering the question, how do we bridge those higher levels of Ein Sof, Atzmus Ein Sof, with the realities that are below the Atzilus? So that's why he's bringing all this in, because he's all connecting all of that and saying that now that even in Biy'a, even Gan Eden in Biy'a is also benefiting from the Yichud Pnimi of Abba Ve'ima that we reached through our Avodah. So everything is becoming Yizbu, sated in a higher level. So initially, Gan Eden is talking not Atzilus. It's Atzei Avaya, which we learned Biy'a, or it's receiving from Atzilus, or it's Zoh of Atzilus, but it's not the highest levels of Atzilus. But through Yizbu, through the Avodah, ultimately through B'chol Moedecha and Mesiras Nefesh, we can reach levels that the lower levels of Gan Eden are actually being sated and filled up. And he explained it in two ways now. First, he said in general, Meimeyim, Chayeyim is Bina, and Yizbu Chayeyim is Pnimis Bina. Meimeyim, water, is Chochma, and Yizbu Meimeyim is Pnimis Chochma. And Matosan is plantings, is Zun. Now he's saying, you could say that the first two referring to Gan Eden as it's in Atzilus, and the third one, the plantings, is Gan Eden as it's in Biy'a, but it too gets sated, and through the Yichud Pnimi of Atzilus, that ultimately draws Moichin, like he said now, all the way into Biy'a, into Moichin, into Gadlus Abba of Biy'a. V'zeu inyan yizbu matosan. And that's the meaning of the third expression, that their plantings should be sated. Their plantings, not just the life and the waters, the higher levels, but also the plantings, the lower levels. Yeah. Good. Gam Yeshlemer, one final Yeshlemer, can also say the koyal and neshama shein matosan dezun. You could also say plantings is not referring to Zoh and Malchus, but it's referring to the plantings that come out of Zoh and Malchus, the neshamas. Remember, we said Yatsu v'nifradu, the neshamas extended from the kelim of Zoh, of Atzilus. That's what he says in Ageres Sekeja Simachav. So you could say the plantings are referring to the souls, not to the Zoh and Malchus. So we find, to understand, summing those all up, that the Bechinas Teisvus Er, Shenimshach B'Gan Eden Alidei Avodah, so we find from all of this that the abundance, the additional energy that's added in Gan Eden, which is called Yizbu, this, by the way, this Menimtza movement is a summary of the whole subject. It doesn't flow from the last sentence. It's the summary of all of it. So finally, he said also the Neshamis. I should have taken a longer pause, so I'm doing that now. And then he says, to conclude, he says, Menimtza move on. So what we derive and understand from all of this, that that this level of abundance of that's added in Gan Eden through our Avodah, the highest levels of Avodah, that this is coming from the core and pleasure, that's higher and higher, much higher, from the level of pleasure that Gan Eden has on its own. So Gan Eden on its own really is more chitzenius Bina, chitzenius Chochma, Zoh, Malchus on the same level of Zoh. But when you go to Yichud Pnimi, you want to Chodosh, something new, a whole new energy, you have to go beyond the regular river and the Mayon and the spring of water and all the regular irrigation of Gan Eden. And you get Tainug Atzmi, Chodosh from the highest levels through the Avodah. So in a way, he's explained now how we bridge Atzilus and Biy'a. That's through our Avodah. We begin with our natural structures, we mature them and we develop them as they grow in the emotional way we've discussed, emotional, cognitive directing emotion, developing new emotions that come from a cognitive contemplation, all the way to the point of Bina, then Chochma, then Pnimius Bina, and Pnimius Chochma. That's not just relates to the emotions, where the emotions get elevated to a new state of beyond their own subjectivity, and that in turn elevates the mind, and the mind elevates the emotions, And now you have godless Meich and godless Abba from drawing all the way from Arich and Atik, but drawing it all downward into all these levels. So everything gets irrigated. You also have the example, irrigated, a garden. You have the garden on its own, growing beautiful trees, beautiful plants. But then here we explain how it all becomes far more abundant through the Avodah l'shamar, the work that the human being does. Especially not just Avodah Birurim, but also ultimately the Avodah Birurim. It begins with Birurim, and we grow in those levels till the point where we get higher than Birurim, the levels we've been talking about, which reach into the Eineg Atzmi all the way built in Murgish, as we've explained. Okay. This is not ending the whole mind. We have plenty to cover, but now the next page, next thing is going to go into further into discussing how do we bridge these realities, which seem to be so different. The subjective human being that starts with an emotional, reflexive, impulsive person, reaching the highest levels of being completely consumed with the divine, is quite an achievement. But he's going to explain further how we bridge these two realities. But I'm going to stop here. Let's take any questions, comments, anything you'd like to ask. Well, you see again, the Rebbe Rashab is very brief here because he's relying that we learned already what is Bina, what is Chochma, what is Zah. Here he's just really tying it together into the expressions of Yizbu. He explained the idea, like I said, the three expressions in Medrash, life, water, and plantings, all in a state of their regular state and how they become sated. But it all connects very eloquently and beautifully. But in case there's something anyone missed, I'm happy to fill in or answer or explain. If it's clear, very good. I'm happy.
What does it mean that there's infinite Gan Edens?
Yeah, exactly what it says.
But how? I mean, I thought there was a Gan Eden Biy'a, Gan Eden Tzilas. Now,
and in Biy'a itself has infinite levels. These are just general terms. I mean, when you're talking in spiritual levels, there's really no end to the levels. We speak in general terms simply because we have to, for us to be able to contain it. But when you speak about it, I mean, every person is just like each one of us has really all types, many levels. So there's no real rigid levels at all. There's really ongoing levels. It all depends on the level of Gili Elikus. If Elikus is Bli Gvul, so the levels of revelation of Elikus is Bli Gvul.
So there's infinite numbers of Gan Edens within each of us?
Well, we're talking now in existence. Within each of us is based on the Gan Eden. First, let's talk about one level of Gan Eden within us. If you want me to explain that, I can explain it. Once you understand one level, yes, we grow through our Avodah. Every day we grow more, and each of us in our own way. But we're not looking to access infinite levels of Gan Eden. We're looking to access our level. The goal here is to access our level. He's just pointing it out because he wants to explain that the Gan Eden itself has Atzilus, there's a Biy'a, there's all the different levels, because you can explain Gan Eden in each particular level. The key is to understand the Gan Eden that you relate to.
Which is what?
You tell me. What's your Avodah? Are you holding by L'cha, Vol Vavcha, B'chol Nafshcha, B'chol Maidecha? This comes down to Avodah of a person. What your Avodah is, Gan Eden is a level of Gili Elikus. In this context, is the Gili like a garden that has trees. A human being has emotions. Emotions grow. Trees grow. You have to look at where you stand in your emotional growth and your emotional relationship with God. So it can be in a very basic, like childish behavioral level. Mutfa. The last 30 pages have been actually mapping out all the levels of growth that are possible for a human being to grow in their love for God and in general in their maturity. So it comes down to defining where a person stands in that context. And Gan Eden, as I explained, is essentially the Gili that is a direct result of our Avodah. So there's a Gan Eden, yes, where neshamas reside after they leave this world. In other words, after they separate from their bodies. That's also not a physical place. It's a spiritual state. And then there's a lam chatir b'chayecha, the things we do now that so-called have a taste of Gan Eden or experience. Like sometimes it says Shabbos is a taste of Gan Eden. Because Shabbos is a somewhat of a taste of Elokus. That's more than just a regular weekday. What we said before, Hitimon, the Ovis, tasted from Olam Haba. Me'ain Olam Haba, the taste of Gan Eden. You say the smell of Gan Eden. So Gan Eden is essentially a divine level. Just like Biy'a, Atzilus, Gan Eden in each world is the Gimel Rishenus we learned, the Keser Chochma Bina of each world. We learned that earlier, the Kodesh Kadosh, like Gan Eden compared to the Beis Hamikdash. So Gan Eden is in the existence a higher, more refined, elevated spiritual state. The Gan Eden that Adam and Chava were on this earth, and that manifested in a physical way. Just like Mitzrayim, there's a physical land called Egypt, but there's still a spiritual concept of Mitzarim v'Gvulim, of limitations. So Gan Eden has a spiritual dimension, which is main role. Like we said here, Chochma running into Bina, the garden, the trees, the Chochma, the Bina. And then there's Gan Eden as it grows, when Hashem says to Adam and Chava, Avodah l'shama, you shall work and protect this garden through the mitzvahs we do, the positive mitzvahs, avoiding the negative. We make the garden grow further in abundance. So the more Avodah we have, the more Gan Eden grows. That Gan Eden is essentially a product of our work. So neshamas benefit from that. And then, of course, there'll be Lasad Lave when all this will come full glory. Like he said, the main gilui of what he said, the ikar of time of the gilui will be Lasad Lave. And there are two different stages. So it's really about understanding levels of divine revelation and experience.
When you said that the Nahar, God, it comes out from the Aiden. Aiden is Chochma. The Nahar is Bina. The Hashkot at the Gan, that you would think that the Gan then wouldn't be Bina, but would be Zah, because Nahar is gone. Maybe I missed that. I mean,
no, Nahar is Bina.
That's
Nahar
what I mean.
is Bina.
Oh.
The Gan is Zah with the trees in it.
Oh, it is Zah. Okay.
The trees and the garden are Zah.
I thought you said that, my mistake. I thought Gan Eden was in Bina.
In general, it's the level of Bina, but when you break it down, because now Yotzim Eden, and that general is the level of Bina. He said that earlier. I pointed out 12 on page 12. What did I say? 12, 13. And Eden has many different. Sometimes you'll see it's Bina, sometimes it's Zah, sometimes Biy'a. Gan Eden has many different ways it's explained. Depends what you're talking about, the root of it, the full manifestation of it. Yeah.
Because the Nahar would be Bina, you would think, and the Gan would be Zah. So that I would think Bina.
Yeah, but in general, they go together. The river is part of Gan Eden too.
Yeah, but it's not the garden.
But in the garden, there's a river.
Okay. And one last question. The Eitz Chaim, Eitz Tovara, within each of us. Normally I learned Eitz Chaim is in a Pneumius Torah, and Eitz Tovara is
I explained that yesterday.
Yes.
Were you here in yesterday's class?
I can hear that.
So it's just correct. In general, yes. But when you break it down further, even Pneumius Torah is still, well, he says Eitz Chaim. Here he's talking Teresh B'Ksav and Teresh B'Al Peh. Sometimes it's explained that way.
Mm-hmm.
So he referred to both ways. Earlier he said Eitz Chaim sweetens the bitter. So it depends. It's all relative ultimately. I explained it in Raya Mehemna. It says Eitz Chaim is Pneumius Torah. Here he's saying Eitz Chaim is Teresh B'Ksav, which still, even though it's pure Oyer, Chochma, Birur, clear, but it still involves itself with Birur. So you could either say that it's a different explanation, or you could say that when you Pneumius Torah, though it's not, doesn't deal with what's right and wrong and arguments of Sheker and Tomei and Toyer, but it still does tell us does talk about this world, and it does talk about bringing God into a world that's a dark world. There's different ways you can explain it, but they definitely refer to both elements. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Overall, Gan Eden's location is Biy'a, Gan Eden Elyon. Sometimes Gan Eden Atachon is Yetzirah. Here he's been referring it to Asiya. There is a Gan Eden Atzilus, but the primary, when you say Gan Eden, you usually mean Biy'a and Yetzirah. Biy'a is where Bina dominates, right? You said Ima mekanino b'kursaya. The mother nests in Biy'a. So Biy'a generally is like Bina, where Atzilus is more like Chochma. But when you break it down, each one has all the levels within them. Like I said many times, there's a lot of scholarless here. So it depends, are you talking generally or specifically and so on. So we want to draw from Chochma into Bina, from Primis HaChochma into Chetzens HaChochma, Primis HaBina. We want to draw from Chochma and Bina into Midas, and we want to draw it all into Biy'a. So it really comes down to, are you talking in the microcosm of the world of Atzilus, or are we talking in the macrocosm of all the worlds? So obviously, Bina of Atzilus is higher than Biy'a, but Bina of Atzilus' primary nesting grounds or nesting place is in Biy'a. We've discussed this. The bottom line is you have to keep in mind this is not physical. It's like you don't have a China within the United States. Every country, every geographical location is in its place. In Ruchnius, it doesn't work that way. There is no geographic physical locations. So the boundaries are very, very different. And they all encompass each other in these spiritual realms, so to speak. Okay. So we'll stop here.